I simply cannot find her. Maria, she's...
The hills looked gentle, the wind harmless. A young woman in a pale dress spun to a melody the world now hums without thinking. But the camera did not capture the sound the crew still remembers, the violent thud of Julie Andrews hitting the grass again and again as a helicopter's downdraft slammed her flat between takes. The most effortless opening in movie history was carved from grit, bruises, and a star who stood up, fixed her skirt, and smiled for one more take. Romance, too, arrived by accident. In the moonlit gazebo, where Maria and Captain Von Trapp finally surrender to love, the lights that promised magic delivered mockery, groaning, wet, obscene sputters every time their lips neared. 20 ruined takes, stifled laughter, a director who killed the lights and let silhouettes do the work. The scene you remember as pure, it was born from darkness. This is the forbidden ledger behind The Sound of Music. A child who could not swim pitched into a freezing lake, a leading man who called the film The Sound of Mucus, yet became its steel-spined heart. A stumble at the villa gate kept in because imperfection felt more human than polish. And beyond the frame, truths Hollywood sanded smooth. An Austrian folk song written on Broadway, an Austrian escape that in reality began at a train station. We will not retell the fairy tale. We will open the case file, the take sheets, the onset mishaps, the compromises, the calculated illusions, and ask why a film about innocence needed so much secrecy to survive. Because sometimes the sweetest story on earth only tastes that way after it's been carefully, meticulously sweetened. Shall we begin? Before The Sound of Music became one of the most beloved films of all time, it began as something far smaller, almost fragile enough to disappear. The real Maria von Trapp was a young woman who had not intended to marry for love. In her own candid words, she wed Georg von Trapp for the children. At 22, she became stepmother to 10 children and wife to a man 25 years her senior. There was no sweeping mountain romance, no moonlit confession, only duty, responsibility, and slowly a bond that would grow into love. The family's story, Austrian singers fleeing the rise of the Third Reich, caught the attention of publishers in the late 1930s, but in selling their rights to Hollywood, the Von Trapps made what would prove to be a fateful mistake. They agreed to a meager sum, a pittance compared to the fortune the story would later generate. By the time the world would come to know their tale, the family itself had already been erased from the profits. After World War II, a small European documentary about the Von Trapps flickered briefly and was nearly forgotten. American studios dismissed it as children and a nun obsessed with singing, hardly the stuff of cinematic legend. Fate intervened in the form of Vincent J. Donahue, a Tony Award-winning director who glimpsed something others had overlooked. He saw not a film, but a stage musical. His vision took shape as a Broadway production starring Mary Martin in 1959. The musical was a thunderous success. Night after night, audiences were lifted by the soaring notes of Climb Every Mountain and Do-Re-Mi. In New York, the Von Trapp story transformed into spectacle, and word spread across the Atlantic to Hollywood executives desperate for their next big hit. That desperation was very real. 20th Century Fox, one of the great studios of the Golden Age, was teetering on the edge of collapse. The disaster of Cleopatra in 1963 had drained tens of millions from the studio's coffers. Fox had sold off land, slashed budgets, and whispered rumors circulated that the studio might close its doors forever. When The Sound of Music was acquired, it was not simply another production, it was a gamble, the last lifeline for a company on the brink. Behind the romantic songs and pastoral settings lay cold numbers and high stakes. For the studio, this was survival.
For Julie Andrews, freshly crowned after Mary Poppins, this was the role that would define or confine her. For Christopher Plummer, a Shakespearean actor of icy precision, it was an assignment he had no part of. It is here, in this crucible of desperation, ambition, and skepticism, that The Sound of Music took its first breath as a film. What the world would later see as a golden fairy tale was, from the very beginning, a story stitched together out of necessity, compromise, and quiet tragedy.
The casting of The Sound of Music was as turbulent as the Alps themselves. Behind the final perfect family that audiences saw on screen was a grueling process of auditions, rejections, and heartbreak. For the role of Liesl, dozens of young actresses lined up, including a then unknown Mia Farrow. At just 20 years old, she auditioned 3 separate times. Director Robert Wise's notes were merciless. Charming, sweet, but lacks energy, cannot dance. With that, the door slammed shut. Ironically, the role went to Charmian Carr, only 1 year older, but with the exact blend of innocence and charisma that the story demanded. This rejection altered Farrow's path forever. She would later carve a legendary career in film, but not as a singing teenager in Salzburg. The children were chosen through long, draining rounds of auditions. Kurt Russell, Patty Duke, and even Terry Garr were considered, but ultimately passed over. The final lineup included Nicholas Hammond as Friedrich, who would go on to become television's very first Spider-Man in 1977. At the time, he was just a teenager with a serious face and a shy manner. The rest of the Von Trapp children formed a genuine bond that extended off-screen, calling each other by character names even years later, reuniting with Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer well into adulthood. Julie Andrews, fresh off her Oscar-winning triumph in Mary Poppins, faced an almost crushing weight of expectation. Audiences expected another magical nanny, another flawless angel gliding through song. Andrews herself was determined to prove otherwise. She insisted Maria von Trapp be played not as a fairy tale figure, but as a woman of flesh and blood, rebellious, stubborn, messy, and real. That demand often brought her into conflict with both Plummer and director Robert Wise, but it also gave the role its depth. Christopher Plummer's involvement was the greatest irony. A classically trained actor, steeped in Shakespeare, he sneered at musicals as sentimental fluff. To him, playing Captain Von Trapp felt like artistic exile. He mocked the project from the beginning, secretly dubbing it The Sound of Mucus. Yet, despite his disdain, his natural stiffness and aloofness became the very essence of the character. What he saw as torment translated on screen into icy restraint, the perfect foil for Andrews's warmth. Every actor chosen carried weight far beyond their years. Carr broke her ankle during filming, but performed through the pain to complete 16 going on 17. Kim Carruth, the youngest at just 5, was adored by castmates but couldn't swim, a fact that nearly turned tragic in the lake scene. Even before the cameras rolled, the risks and sacrifices were already mounting. By the time filming began in Salzburg, the cast had become a patchwork family. Andrews, the stern older sister, Plummer, the reluctant father, and a troop of children who would forever remember the experience as both the best and most dangerous summer of their lives. The fairy tale was set, but as cameras rolled, reality would fight back, again and again. By the spring of 1964, Salzburg became the backdrop of one of Hollywood's riskiest gambles. The cameras rolled on The Sound of Music, a film that needed not only to succeed, but to rescue 20th Century Fox from ruin. What followed was a production filled with contradictions, scenes that shimmered with magic on screen, but were born out of exhaustion, improvisation, and constant threat of collapse. The opening alone became immortal. Julie Andrews, arms outstretched, spinning against a sea of green hills, it remains one of the most recognizable shots in cinema. Yet what the world saw as effortless grace was chaos in reality.
A helicopter, flown low to capture the sweeping aerial, battered her with violent downdrafts. Each time the machine circled back, Andrews was flung face first into the grass. Crew members watched in horror as she scrambled up, brushed herself off, and returned to position. It took hours of punishment to capture a mere seconds-long vision of perfection. Then came the songs. Do Re Mi, filmed across Salzburg's landmarks, transformed the city itself into a stage. My Favorite Things and Edelweiss became global anthems, even though the latter was not Austrian at all, but a Broadway invention. Ironically, Austrians never embraced it, while Americans believed it to be their most cherished folk song. Presidents, school choirs, and everyday families sang it for decades, proof of Hollywood's unmatched ability to manufacture tradition. One of the most romantic moments, the moonlit gazebo kiss between Maria and Captain Von Trapp, was nearly a disaster. Massive carbon arc lamps, designed to create an ethereal glow, instead sputtered and groaned at the exact moment Andrews and Plummer leaned in. The noises resembled obscene raspberries, destroying the mood again and again. 20 takes collapsed into laughter. Finally, director Robert Wise scrapped the plan entirely. He filmed the scene in silhouette, their faces shadowed, their kiss a mere outline. By accident, disaster turned to genius. The darkness birthed one of the most hauntingly romantic moments ever captured. But Salzburg itself fought back. When the production attempted to hang Nazi banners across city buildings for the Anschluss sequence, outrage erupted. Officials called it intolerable to see swastikas waving once again in their streets. Wise delivered an ultimatum: either allow the props, or he would use real archival footage of Salzburg cheering Hitler in 1938. The city, cornered by its own history, relented. The banners flew, the cameras rolled, and one of the film's most chilling sequences was preserved. For locals, it was a painful reminder that the past could not be erased. Meanwhile, the children carried much of the film's spirit. Their laughter and energy gave authenticity to scenes that might otherwise have drowned in sentimentality. Off-screen, they bonded deeply with Andrews, who became a surrogate older sister. But the production was not always safe. In the famous lake scene, when the family's boat tips, 5-year-old Kim Karoth, unable to swim, nearly drowned. Andrews, supposed to save her, fell backward in the wrong direction. Another actor leapt in, pulling the child to safety, but not before she swallowed water and vomited in terror. On screen, the moment looks playful. In truth, it was a near tragedy. Despite these hidden dangers, the film took shape as something extraordinary. When production wrapped and the reels arrived in Hollywood, executives knew they had a potential hit. What they did not expect was an explosion. Released in March 1965, The Sound of Music became an overnight phenomenon. Audiences lined up around blocks. Screenings ran back-to-back from morning to midnight. Families returned again and again, children singing along in theaters. Its $8 million budget was recouped almost instantly, and the box office soared past $286 million, unheard of at the time. It not only saved Fox from bankruptcy, but restored it to dominance. Award season crowned the victory. The film took home 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Andrews, already beloved from Mary Poppins, was cemented as a global icon. Plummer, despite his disdain, became forever linked to Captain Von Trapp, a role he could never outrun. The cultural aftershocks were even greater. By the time it premiered on American television in 1976, nearly half the country tuned in. A staggering 33.6 rating made it one of the most watched broadcasts of its era. Suddenly, living rooms across the United States echoed with Do Re Mi. Children reenacted the Hilltop Spin. Families sang So Long Farewell before bedtime. The film had leaped beyond cinema into national memory. For many, it was a dream preserved in celluloid. The beauty of Austria, the triumph of love, the innocence of music in the face of war. Yet beneath that shimmering surface lay a harsher truth, one the cast and crew knew too well. The perfection was stitched from bruises, exhaustion, compromises, and accidents that no studio dared reveal. And still, against all odds, the gamble worked. The Sound of Music did not just succeed, it redefined success. It proved that even a studio on the brink of collapse could be resurrected by a story of children, a nun, and a love that was more myth than memory.
If The Sound of Music glittered with charm and melody on the screen, the reality of its making was far darker. Behind every moment of cinematic magic lurked conflict, accidents, and bitter truths that the studio worked tirelessly to bury. The first cracks appeared in the most celebrated moments. The hilltop opening, beloved by millions, was not a dance with nature, but a brutal battle. Julie Andrews was hurled face first into the ground again and again by helicopter downdrafts so violent that grass flattened around her like a storm path. What looked like serenity was survival. Andrews scrambling up between takes, smiling through gritted teeth, praying the camera would capture one perfect spin before she was flattened once more. Then came the infamous gazebo kiss. The audience saw moonlight, tenderness, and the swell of love between Maria and Captain Von Trapp. What the crew endured was humiliation. Carbon arc lamps, meant to cast an ethereal glow, instead sputtered and groaned with grotesque wet raspberries every time Andrews and Plummer leaned in. 20 takes were ruined by laughter, their concentration shattered by obscene noises. Finally, director Robert Wise surrendered to the absurdity, killing the lights and filming the kiss in silhouette. What became one of cinema's most iconic romantic moments was in fact an act of desperation. Accidents were not confined to adults. The lake scene, immortalized as playful family chaos, nearly turned tragic. Kim Karoth, just 5 years old and unable to swim, was tossed into icy water. Andrews, positioned to save her, fell backward instead of forward. For one chilling moment, the child vanished beneath the surface. She surfaced again, choking, terrified, and had to be hauled out by a quick-thinking co-star. The laughter you see on screen hides a crew shaken to the core, realizing how close they had come to filming a child's death. For Christopher Plummer, the danger was not physical, but artistic. A Shakespearean actor, he despised the syrupy sentiment of musicals. He mocked the production as the Sound of Mucus and drowned his disillusionment in alcohol, arriving at long shoots fortified by drink. Yet his disdain became the captain's cold detachment. His resistance translated into a performance audiences adored. The paradox was cruel. The more he hated the role, the more unforgettable it became. Decades later, he admitted the film haunted him, following him around like an albatross. Even Andrews, often remembered as luminous and gentle, wielded her own kind of severity. Determined not to be trapped in a sugary repeat of Mary Poppins, she pressed Robert Wise relentlessly for realism. "How can this be more real?" she demanded, again and again, forcing reshoots and script adjustments. Crew members whispered she acted as co-director, her perfectionism both saving the film from saccharine collapse and driving colleagues to exhaustion. The toll was visible. Daniel Truitt, cast as the young Nazi suitor Rolf, was forced to bleach his naturally dark hair until it scorched his scalp. His golden locks never recovered. For the rest of his life, his hair grew thin and brittle, a permanent scar from a role meant to showcase youthful charm. Even Andrews herself suffered when a botched dye job turned her hair blazing orange. In panic, the crew bleached it platinum blonde to disguise the disaster, leaving her looking more Austrian, but at the cost of her natural beauty. The conflicts extended beyond the set. The Salzburg Marionette Theater, guardians of a centuries-old art form, rejected the filmmaker's request to supply puppets for The Lonely Goatherd. They considered Hollywood's project sappy and beneath them. The irony was bitter. Years later, when The Sound of Music drew thousands of tourists to Salzburg, the same theater staged its own puppet version of the film to capitalize on the craze. What they once scorned became their salvation.
And then there was censorship. In France, authorities cut the nuns' songs, declaring secular music from women of the church an insult. Maria and Climb Every Mountain, the spiritual core of the story, were silenced. In Salzburg, Nazi banners nearly sparked riots. Officials refused to see swastikas raised again until Wise threatened to expose archival footage of the city cheering Hitler. Only then did they relent. For locals, the film was not nostalgia. It was a wound, reopened. Beneath every smile, every melody, every triumphant scene, shadows gathered. The Sound of Music was hailed as innocent joy, but it was forged in exhaustion, accidents, humiliation, and conflict. Its sweetness was not born naturally. It was engineered, imposed, and demanded. And yet, perhaps it is very friction, this resistance against collapse, that gave the film its peculiar power. When the world sang Do, Re, Mi, they were singing not just a fairy tale, but the echoes of hidden chaos.
Beneath the glittering surface of The Sound of Music lay a truth far less romantic than the Hollywood version the world fell in love with. For the Von Trapp family, the tragedy was not on the screen, but in the way their lives were rewritten, censored, and sold for profit they would never see. The most jarring distortion was the escape itself. Audiences watched breathlessly as the family trudged to cross the Alps, climbing toward freedom in Switzerland under the shadow of Nazi oppression. In reality, there was no mountain climb. The Von Trapps simply walked to the train station in Salzburg, boarded a train, and crossed the border legally using their Italian passports. The grand sequence of courage, danger, and triumph was pure invention. Hollywood mythology crafted to heighten the drama. The love story between Maria and Captain Von Trapp was also reshaped. In the film, their romance blossoms as Austria crumbles, their kiss a symbol of hope amidst chaos. But Maria herself admitted she married Georg not for love, but for his children. "I liked him, but I didn't love him," she once said. Their wedding took place in 1927, years before the Nazi annexation, when Maria was just 22 and Georg was 47. The sweeping love story that enchanted millions was, in truth, a marriage of duty that only blossomed into affection much later. Even the family itself was altered. Georg had 10 children, but Hollywood cut the number to 7. Names, ages, and personalities were rewritten. The real Agatha, quiet and shy, became Liesel, a bubbly teenager singing 16 going on 17. 3 children were erased completely, their existence sacrificed for a cleaner narrative. The Von Trapp children reportedly laughed when they saw their fictional selves on screen, recognizing how little of their truth remained. Financially, the betrayal was devastating. The family had sold their rights for just $9,000, a meager sum compared to the fortune the story generated. While The Sound of Music grossed more than $286 million worldwide and saved 20th Century Fox from bankruptcy, the Von Trapps themselves saw nothing. The legend of their lives made others rich, but left them with only the memories of a tale they barely recognized. Censorship added insult to injury. In France, religious authorities cut the nuns' songs, silencing Maria and Climb Every Mountain for being deemed sacrilegious. What remained was a hollowed-out version of the story stripped of its spiritual core. In Salzburg, Nazi banners nearly tore open old wounds when locals refused to see swastikas flying again, proof that even decades later, the scars of history still bled. The tragedy of The Sound of Music was that it offered the world a dream at the expense of reality. For the Von Trapps, their true story, messy, imperfect, and unprofitable, was erased. What endured was the fairy tale, beautiful, timeless, but not their own. When The Sound of Music premiered in 1965, audiences saw only beauty. Rolling green hills, songs that seemed eternal, and a story that promised love could conquer fear. It was hailed as a masterpiece, showered with 5 Academy Awards, and embraced as one of Hollywood's crowning achievements.
For decades, it lived in living rooms and classrooms, its melodies etched into childhoods across the globe. Yet the true legacy of the film lies in its contradictions. Christopher Plummer, who mocked it as the sound of mucus, found himself forever tethered to the very role he despised. Julie Andrews, bruised by helicopters and scarred by relentless perfectionism, became immortalized as Maria, the radiant heart of a story she had fought to ground in realism. The Von Trapp family, meanwhile, lived with the irony of seeing their history distorted for entertainment, their real struggles transformed into Hollywood myth. The forbidden secrets, accidents, humiliations, near tragedies were locked away for decades. Bloopers were buried, interviews scripted, and cast members forbidden to reveal what had happened behind the camera. The world was allowed to see only the polished dream. And yet, when those secrets finally emerged, they added a strange, almost haunting depth to the legend. The film's sweetness became sharper, its innocence more complex, because we now know what it cost to create. In the end, The Sound of Music is more than a family musical. It is a paradox, a story of joy built from strain, of perfection carved out of imperfection, of light cast against shadow. Its legacy endures not because it was flawless, but because, even through chaos and conflict, it touched something eternal in audiences everywhere. The hills were alive, but so were the secrets, and perhaps that is why the film still sings. Behind the curtain of The Sound of Music lies a truth far stranger than fiction. The world remembers flawless hills, perfect songs, and a love story untouched by shadows. But we now know that the dream was built on accidents, secrecy, and illusions Hollywood never wanted us to see. That is the essence of cinema. What is hidden becomes more powerful than what is shown. So I ask you, when you watch Maria spinning on the hill or hear the haunting notes of Edelweiss, will you see only the fairy tale or the fragile reality beneath it? If these hidden files of Hollywood fascinate you, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because here, beyond the red carpet, the secrets never stay buried.